Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron, and Grind Gear Games has just released their preview for the first major update to the Path of Exile 2 early access release. That major update is going to be happening on April the 4th, so less than a week away now. And in this video, I'm just going to go through a summary of what was covered for the changes for this upcoming patch. So it's being called Dawn of the Hunt, and let's hop in and talk about one's quick summary as we dive in. The Huntress was added with Ritualist and Amazon Ascendancies. There are also new Ascendancies for existing classes, new summoning skills, 100 plus new support gems, 100 plus new unique items, new types of extra content, which is basically mostly just Path of Exile 1 League mechanics. There have been changes to the endgame loop, and there have been the addition of, I call them recombinators. In fact, I should more accurately call it recombinating, a crafting system. Recombinators, it's a holdover from Path of Exile 1 terminology. In addition, there was also a separate interview that was published right around the time of this announcement, and it had some questions and answers about other classes, game design philosophy, planned balance changes, some clarifications on the announcement video, and a release timeline. So let's dive in with the Huntress class. And before we proceed to the Ascendancies, let me make note of the fact that she is wearing a belt of skulls around her waist. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I do believe that is a reference to the Path of Exile 1 item, the Headhunter, which allows you to absorb modifiers from rare enemies that you defeat. So let's move on and talk about her first Ascendancy, the Ritualist. Let's take a look. I will give you a moment to absorb what you're looking at. Feel free to pause if need be. And let's first draw our attention to, as the Whispers ask, Ritual Sacrifice. And this is what I was talking about with that Headhunter-like belt. So what Ritual Sacrifice actually does is, it's not automatic. You do have to cast a skill, cast a spell, but it is on the corpse of a deceased monster, and it lets you absorb one of their modifiers in a manner very much like Headhunter from Path of Exile 1. These can be any modifiers like health, damage, reduced damage to elements, all kinds of different stuff. But then the follow-up node to that, Ritual Sacrifice, this lets, or as the Whispers demand, it lets you use Ritual Sacrifice on yourself to grant a random monster modifier. It does require sacrificing 20% of your life. Just some other interesting things about this Ascendancy. You can have one additional ring slot for 3 total, which is a huge bonus. I believe this should interact with the Ingenuity belt. It does come with the drawback that you have to choose one of reduced mana, spirit, or elemental resistances. But then you do also have this node that you can take that gives you increased bonuses from equipped rings and amulets. So any life, any resistance, any strength, anything like that that your ring is giving you, this increases that. There's also some interaction with charms on this Ascendancy, but let's go ahead and move on, talk about the other Huntress Ascendancy that is being introduced. This will be 2 out of the total of 3 eventually. This second one is the Amazon. And this should be familiar to anybody who played Diablo 2. In fact, they showed off some skills that looked remarkably like the Lightning Javazon from back in Diablo 2. A lot of nostalgia there. So I like the idea of overstacking accuracy to get things like critical strike chance, which comes from just, it's called critical strike, I guess. Gain additional critical strike chance equal to 25% of excess chance to hit with attacks. That's what you get for stacking accuracy. So this may actually be additional critical critical hit chance. So this may actually be adding to base crit, we'll have to see. But also penetrate, attacks using your weapons have added physical damage equal to 25% of the accuracy of the weapon. So 2 different ways of benefiting from stacking accuracy. One thing I'm not really a fan of with this Ascendancy is this idea of open weakness and in for the kill. Open weakness is not one that I hate, so it comes from this predatory instinct. Basically what it does is it adds little segments to the health bar of nearby rare and unique enemies, and while those segments of the health bar are active, like that's the portion of the health bar that you're dealing damage to, they take more damage from you at that time. That part is fine. That's basically, that amounts to enemies take X increased damage, or enemies have X% reduced life. That's all fine. I'm not a huge fan of this idea of with an open weakness. So I believe this phrasing likely means while you are actively hitting that open weakness, not just as long as there's an enemy nearby that has potential weaknesses to exploit. I think this means that these benefits of movement speed and skill speed are only active, number one, while such an enemy is nearby, and number two, while that portion of their health bar is active. And once you deal enough damage to reduce them to a normal portion of their health bar, I believe that means that this would not be active, which is unfortunate. I just don't like cycling damage or defense buffs. Personal preference. The Stalking Panther node is interesting. It doubles evasion from helmet, gloves, and boots while having the evasion from your body armor, which, the way I'm reading this, just from a meta perspective, is this seems to incentivize using a unique body armor that maybe doesn't give a ton of evasion to begin with, or maybe it doesn't give any evasion at all, but it gives you some other potent benefit that fits in nicely with your build, and it lets you kind of get the benefits of the evasion that you would normally get from a body armor. You're going to get that from the rest of your equipment instead. So it's interesting. The flask thing, life flask also recover mana. Mana also recovers life. It's cool, and I'm going to say this again about another Ascendancy node in a bit, but I'm not a huge fan of the gameplay style that relies so much on life and mana flasks. Like, I like the idea that they're in the game, but I do wish we could build around them a little bit, like build to avoid them if necessary. So let's move on from the Amazon and let's talk about non-Huntress Ascendancies that were introduced for existing classes. So the Warrior is receiving its third Ascendancy, the Smith of Kitava. This is an interesting one, and this is probably the one that I'm most excited for. The way Zizarin put it, and I appreciate this, was he said, this is the hardcore default class. Well, why? It's inheriting some nodes from Path of Exile 1's Chieftain, so modifiers to fire resistance and maximum fire resistance can also apply to cold resistance, cold and lightning resistance and max resistance. And what that means is you only have to stack one type of resistance. You stack it to the moon, and then you get the benefits of that for all elements. So that's a huge benefit for hardcore. It's a huge benefit for solo self-found, where these things may be more difficult to come across. But there's a few interesting things here. You get a manifest weapon, which is like an animate weapon. It's a minion temper weapon, which gives your weapon, it's a temporary skill that gives your weapon explodey chance. Fire spell on hit. This is an interesting trigger skill. I want to talk more about Smith's Masterwork, which is this weird section along the bottom of his tree here. And this does not cost a skill point to assign. You can assign it freely, but to assign any of the nodes within it, you can assign them freely, but they cost an ascendancy point. Now, my interpretation of this is that they each cost 1. I could be wrong. They may later reveal that it costs 2 ascendancy points to add one of these. And the difference, of course, being every time that you take one of your ascendancies, you get 2 points. And normally, you assign 1 to a small node, 1 to a large node. If this is only taking up 1 of those 2 points, of which you have a total of 8, that's way more powerful. Obviously, you can select many of these. And what this does is, it says, yes, you can only use a normal body armor, so a white title, no resistance, no strength, no increased defenses, no life, nothing like that. But you can take any of these for 1 point apiece, unaffected by ignite. Huge amounts of like fire resistance obviously would play very nicely with what we're trying to do in this build. Regen, reduced crit bonus against you, fizz hits taken as fire. Fizz conversion to fire is very powerful. It helps mitigate the unfortunate state that armor is in right now, that it doesn't do much for physical damage. Well, it doesn't need to if the physical damage coming in is lower because you're taking Molten Symbol. So this is a very interesting class, very tanky looking. I'm curious to see where the damage is going to come from. Are you going to rely on Fire Spell on hit? Are you going to rely on Temper Weapon for your damage? I don't know. We'll have to see. But it is exciting. I love a tanky class. Moving on to the third Mercenary class. This one is called the Tactitian. Now, this was presented as kind of like an Aura bot adjacent kind of a class, where you are a support class for the rest of your party and you're playing with other characters. But I also think that this has some potential with minions, perhaps. So I think the main things to recognize with this class's potential for minions is, number one, Watch how I do it. Allies in your presence gain added attack damage equal to 25% of your main hand's weapon damage. Well, allies does include party members, but it also includes minions. So that is a minion buff right there. And the other major thing is this skill, Supporting Fire. This was not at all clear during the original presentation, but it turns out this skill, Supporting Fire, where a bunch of arrows appear from off-screen from invisible allies of yours, those are counted as minions. This skill is counted as a minion skill. Any buffs, plus minion skills, anything like that, increased minion damage, they will impact this Supporting Fire. Now, there's going to be restrictions for this, I'm sure, but I am very interested to see whether this could be a build around skill or whether you could use this with some other minions around you to support. There are some other minimal support, so yes, you can use pin, which this class is leaning into the pin mechanic. You could use that to kind of help keep enemies at a distance, assist your minions. Increased Spirit, of course, helps you summon more of minions other than this Supporting Fire skill. It's just weird. We've also got this totem node here. Totems are not minions. They're not qualified as minions. They're a totally different kind of thing. So I am personally interested in using this as a potential minion class. And I'll just say a quick word about Staylight Use Cover. Not a huge fan of this. It's encouraging you to use both evasion and physical damage, or armor rather. So it's capping the amount of phys damage reduction that you get from armor, which, like, I guess in a way, I guess that's not too much of a drawback because you're already not getting a ton out of armor to begin with. So defend with 200% of armor is maybe just like a free bonus. But maximum evade chance is 50 is not great. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. My initial reaction is not a huge fan of it. I'd rather get my defenses elsewhere. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about the third Witch Ascendancy of the Lich. And this one bears definitely some resemblance to the current PoE 1 Witch class of Occultist. It's got a couple of nodes that strongly resemble it. So Rupture the Soul, cursed enemies killed by you or your allies have a 33% chance to explode, dealing percent of their life as chaos damage. That is straight up a ported over Profane Bloom. It's the same Ascendancy node. It's very powerful. This is very, very strong. I assume it's going to be just as strong in this game, especially since Grinding Gear Games seems to be tamping down on some of the chain exploding effects by doing things like nerfing the heralds chaining off of each other. So having a source of explosions is potentially very strong if it's one of the few ones remaining. Additionally, Dominion over Flesh, you can apply additional curse. Curses can affect hexproof enemies. That is a straight, again, a port over from Occultist. But there's some other interesting things going on here too. So let's talk about Unholy Might. So Unholy Might is being granted by this necromantic conduit node as long as you are not on low mana, but the node saps your mana at 5% per second. So you have to have some mechanism of regaining your mana very quickly, or you're going to be sitting there tapping your mana flask constantly, which I can assure you will be tedious. Having played one of the old mana stacking miner builds from many leagues ago in Path of Exile 1, having to sit there and tap your mana flask constantly, not for me. So I would recommend trying to build around having high mana regen to overcome that. But the Unholy Might, this is the old version of Unholy Might from Path of Exile 1 before it got reworked. It grants 30, or actually, it's not quite. So 30% of all damage as extra chaos damage. That's a little different. And that's good because that means that you can scale fire damage, cold damage, whatever you want. So that's interesting. And this is being boosted potentially by Blackened Heart here. 4% increased magnitude of Unholy Might buffs you grant per 100 maximum mana. So that's both Unholy Might on you, and if your skill, your Necromantic Conduit, is granting Unholy Might to anyone else, allies, minions. So here's another potential strong minion ascendancy. Infernalist will have some stiff competition and maybe get supplanted as the main witch minion ascendancy here. So that's two already that are leaning into the minion thing. There's also this interesting node, Crystalline Phylactery. They frame this as kind of a Voldemort Sauron, kind of put a piece of your soul into a jewel sort of a thing. And what it does is it doubles the effects of whatever rare jewel that you put in there that you would normally put on your skill tree, with the downside that if you have run out of energy shield, You have 50% more mana cost of all skills. But this is clearly an Ascendancy that doesn't want you to run out of energy shield. This is a very interestingly phrased one. Eternal life. Your life cannot change while you have energy shield. So I've never seen that phrasing before. Life cannot change. And what it kind of reads as is it's kind of like a chaos inoculation, but your life isn't reduced to 1. Like, you basically, as long as your enemy, there are niche cases where that's not true, right? So there are cases where your life, or pardon me, your energy shield is reduced to 0, and then you can take chaos damage. That's not true with chaos inoculation. On the other hand, if your energy shield is reduced to 0 with chaos inoculation, you're dead anyway, so it doesn't matter. So this, there must be something I'm missing, because this reads to me as a strictly better chaos inoculation. I know the difference. So in Path of Exile 2, bleeding. So bleeding will still affect you, but your life cannot change while you have energy shield. Your life cannot change. So as long as you can prevent minions from knocking you down to 0 energy shield, yeah, it's like chaos inoculation, but better. You do have a supplemental life pool behind it. You can do things with that life pool. That bears exploration for sure. Soulless form, 10% of damage taken bypass. There we go. There's the drawback. I did not take note that Soulless form is a mandatory node in order to take Eternal life. 10% of damage taken bypasses energy shield. But doesn't Eternal life make up for that? Like, no, 10% of damage taken bypasses energy shield, but no, it doesn't. So does taking these two together basically negate 10% of damage? Because it's attempting to bypass energy shield, but your life cannot change? So you're taking the damage. Maybe that's what the phrasing means. You're taking the damage, but the life doesn't change. This would also be expected to impact any sources of, like, what, scaling when you take damage. I would expect this to work. Total speculation, but very interesting, very worth considering. Price of power, non-channeling spells consume power charges to deal 25% more damage. So charges work very differently in Path of Exile 2 than 1, but this is still, nevertheless, very reminiscent of the Occultist class, which worked with power charges. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. I love the Smith of Kitava, but I really like this Ascendancy too. I'd be interested to play around with it, and I'm curious to see what people do with it. That's it on the classes, though. Let's move on and talk about some other issues, like the new skill, Bind Spectre. Very familiar to anybody who played Path of Exile 1, Raise Spectre. It lets you just target an enemy corpse and raise it as an allied minion. The difference in Path of Exile 2 being that the strength of the minion will determine how much spirit it reserves. So you can have a bunch of little guys, or you can choose a couple few really big guys, which that seems like the play to me, although it may not be quite as intuitive because specters in this game automatically resummon themselves, a huge benefit over Path of Exile 1 as long as the specters persist. As long as they persist and there's no way of accidentally deleting them, losing them, that kind of thing. That was always the most frustrating part in Path of Exile 1, was you accidentally removed the gem and your specters went away and you couldn't get them back, and then you had to go find another corpse. Like, I could pass on that. So hopefully we don't have that issue. The other new summoning skill is Roa Mount. Now, this does qualify as a minion. It has not been shown how much damage scaling this has, or whether it's really intended just for its other effect of you ride it. And while you are riding it, at least if you're wielding a bow and arrow, I don't know if this qualifies for crossbows too, but with bow and arrow, maybe javelin throwing, unclear, you can move around freely while also firing with no movement penalty. So if you're using dual joysticks, or if you're using WASD or anything, you can be moving around the enemies with no movement penalty and still firing your skills if you are mounted to the Roa, with the drawback that if you get knocked off by taking enough damage, you're stunned and you're probably going to die. So moving forward, 100 new support gems. More than 100 have been introduced. Obviously, we can't go over them all. They only showed a few. I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple. Hamo Crystals and Alignment. So both of these, in their way, kind of to me demonstrate that GGG is still fighting back against endgame zoominess, and they're kind of doing it through sheer force of will. They're hoping, I think, that if they introduce enough reasons to, in the case of hemocrystals, use a couple of different skills. So like you have to use one skill to inflict bleed, and then you use this skill, or this, a skill supported by hemocrystals to explode those bleeds, or with alignment, they're hoping that you will kind of line yourself up in a certain way to align with wherever the support gem is pointing and attack in that way. It's attempting to do this kind of like endgame slowdown thing, and I think they still have work to do on balancing the monsters in the game to even allow this playstyle. Like there's some very interesting things that they're introducing, but none of it will matter if the character just dies whenever they try to interact with this stuff. This is why the broken builds that they talk about nerfing and the balance changes that are going to come with this patch are going to nerf several broken interactions, but it's why people gravitated towards exploding whole screens was not just that it's satisfying, though it is, but also because if you don't explode whole screens, you just get surrounded, swarmed, and killed. There was no level of tankiness sufficient enough to stop you from dying. So things like this, it doesn't seem like you're ever going to have the time to use stuff like this if the monsters keep up with the damage that they're dealing and the speed that they've got, and player defenses stay where they are. So just my commentary on that. Some additional new content added, 7 new map tile sets. That is welcome. Not a huge amount, but still definitely welcome. And they mentioned that they have some interesting interactions, like things to find, little activities to do that will, create little interactions within the map. So that's something to explore. Now we're going to get into talking about some of the new extra content, so to speak, things like Breach and Expedition and so forth, more of that. Things that can appear in your map, and most of these are related in some way or directly ported over from Path of Exile 1 League mechanics. So the first is Asmarian Wisps, this idea that you follow a wisp around, it buffs up enemies, you can let it go and stay out of your sight for a while if you need it to dissipate, because it is making these enemies harder, but it also makes them more rewarding as well. So it's kind of a, you get to choose. Rogue Exiles, this is very familiar to people from Path of Exile 1. They are apparently going to act even more like exiles, that is to say, like player characters. They're going to have player skills, player gear, and in fact, whatever gear they are wearing, they will drop. Whatever unique items they're wearing, they will drop if you defeat them. And it's slightly randomized from exile to exile. There are 12 different distinct exiles, and according to Mark and Jonathan, each individual one of the 12 have like a pool of different unique items that they can randomly roll to wear. So if you see a particular rogue exile, they're more likely to have a certain unique item. Now, whether there are like rarity tiers to this, like, oh, if I fight this guy 1,000 times, he might drop like an ingenuity or whatever, I don't know. That was not announced, but just something to keep an eye out for. Unique strong boxes, nothing too crazy going on here. Strong boxes that you click on and they have a unique and interesting effect. This one's a little more interesting. So they're changing the endgame loop a little bit. So this business of pursuing corruption across the Atlas. Here, apparently how it's going to work is when you are in a corrupted map, there will be these areas, like actual physical areas that you can come across in the map called corruption. And if you cleanse those little areas, you build up something called this corrupted Nexus, is my understanding. So a particular map, it's not a tower, but it is an individual map that has this kind of spike of corruption on it, and you're somehow building up this corrupted Nexus, perhaps to be more rewarding in some way. Didn't quite catch that part, but it's basically in order to make the early endgame loop a little bit more goal-oriented. You've got a little bit more of a concrete thing to do in each map and a concrete thing to work towards in the environment. And if you cleanse this corrupted Nexus, look at how it changed everything from red around it to these kind of white crystals around it, which changes a variety of things about the surrounding maps, things like the monsters that are in them, the bosses that are in them, but most importantly, in my opinion, it changes a specific reward that is now available in those maps, the Fracturing Orb. The first time this is being introduced to Path of Exile 2, but very familiar to Path of Exile 1 players, it will fracture a random modifier on a rare item. What does it mean to fracture? Well, as long as that item has 4 mods, it will pick one at random and it will lock it. See how this modifier 3 to all minion skills is now listed in gold. That means that you can do whatever you want to this item. You can use Chaos Orbs on this item all you want, or any other crafting available to you. I think at the moment it might just be Chaos Orbs that you can use on it, but any additional crafting options that are available in the future, you can apply to this, and it will not change that modifier. It will just change the modifiers around it. So you use the fracturing orb to try and fracture a very good modifier, and then you use any crafting tools available to you to try and get more good modifiers around it with one layer of RNG removed. Basically, it's way easier to get something that you need. Other endgame loop change, a variety of changes to towers, so they are way less common but more powerful. The tablets that you put in them add mechanics to twice as many maps by default. There is now incentive to use higher tier maps in your towers. So if you use a higher tier, higher rarity map, it increases the number of surrounding maps that is affected by your tablets. And if you use a map with more mods, a higher rarity map, in your tower, when you go to complete the tower, you can consume additional number of tablets in that tower, so the maps that are affected, you can do more things to them. And this is kind of to make up for the fact that with the towers further apart now, there will not be as much overlapping. That to me is a hidden buff in a big way, because it means you're not going to be doing as much work like, oh, I've got to go do this tower, and then do this tower, and then do this third one over here to make sure there's a section of maps in the middle of the Venn diagram that has all three of those things overlapping and all of those mechanics. No, as long as you run the tower the right way, now you get that for all the maps in the area of one tower. So that's great, in my opinion. The other benefit is that now towers can spawn with all extra content, any kind of expedition, Asmarian wisps, bosses, anything like that. So they should just be more engaging, and that is definitely welcome. That was a common complaint, I think, is that towers needed a little bit more juice to them, and this gives me a reason to feel good about completing a tower. Thumbs up. There's also unique tablets that have been introduced, and I wanted to highlight this one in particular because it's like a little wormhole. This is very powerful, very valuable, and this might have been their little way of overcoming the issue where the Atlas generation system can sometimes generate you a map node that you might really want to get to, but there's no connections to it. Now, I hope they fix that problem for real, but in the meantime, you could always use one of these guys, assuming they're not too expensive, that lets you access any map in range, regardless of whether you have completed a map near it. This also prevents you from getting locked out if you... Oh, actually, no, they've taken away the map failure system. But in any case, this is powerful and this is interesting, and it should help you go in the direction that you want on your Atlas. The other big change to the endgame loop is portals. Thinking with portals. So this is a commonly requested change by a lot of us. You now have more portals allowing you to die at least once in a map. Now, this will go, so it starts with 6, which is the way Path of Exile 1 works, that you can enter a map up to 6 times if you die. However, this will be reduced, I believe they said, with the rarity, the number of mods on the map. I don't think they said by the tier of the map. Now, maybe that will change in the future, but this is kind of unfortunate because if they're saying that just making a map rare or giving it, a sufficient number of mods means that you're back to only one portal, that's, if anything, worse than before, because now you can't exit the map to trade or do anything else, bring gear back. You lose access to the portals for that reason, but also you don't get to die. So I hope they fix that. It would be great if every map allows at least one death, no matter how many mods you add to it. Give me that at least. Allow me at least one death per map to kind of shake the rust off, shake the tire off, go, oh, that map can get me. Geez, that would be great. And then another big thing that's being added, a crafting tool, Recombination. Yet another thing very familiar to Path of Exile 1 players, though they did say that it would be working differently than Path of Exile 1 Recombination. Allegedly, it allows you to choose how many modifiers from each item you want to appear on the resulting item, but the more you choose, the less the odds of success. And unlike Path of Exile 1, where you get a resulting item no matter what, here, if the recombination fails, both items are deleted. What wasn't 100% clear to me was whether you get to choose which items, or pardon me, which modifiers you want to go in. It would be very powerful if you could say, I want these 2 specific mods to go in. It's very common that you have 2 tier 1 mods and you don't care too much what else is on the item. I'd be more than happy to say recombine 2 or 3 mods and make sure the resulting item has that much. But this is going to be a powerful tool, even if you can't exactly choose them. Just being able to throw items into the Recombinator until you get something that you need, very strong. I recommend you explore this if you didn't in Path of Exile 1. So just some general notes now, and some content from the article that was published simultaneously with the announcement. So first of all, there is going to be an economy reset in the vein of a league reset, where you can start in this new Dawn of the Hunt environment where you have nothing, nobody has anything. I think most experienced players are going to do this. They want to experience the new economy without all the broken interactions and all the currency that allowed people to build up. But unlike a normal league launch, this is not going to, none of the new things that we've discussed so far is going to be limited to the new economy reset. So normally the economy reset and the league are the same thing. They happen at the same time. They're all tied together, and everything else is standard mode. Standard mode normally in Path of Exile 1 would not get new league content. Just everything from the previous league gets shuffled over to it. In this case, and in only this case, they did say that in the future league resets would go about being tied to the economy reset. But in this case, if you want to keep playing your existing characters in standard, you can do that, and you will experience all of the changes that the rest of us are experiencing who do the economy reset. But you'll be in an environment that, number one, probably has fewer players because a lot of people are going to be doing this, and number two, a lot of the wealth will be entrenched, calcified. Everybody has a million divines who's still playing over there, so it might be harder to buy kind of the low-level things that you need. And then just some notes on questions they answered in the article, which I will link in the description. They don't think that the campaign versus endgame pacing is a problem, how the campaign is slow and methodical and the endgame is fast. They think that broken builds are the problem. I disagree with them. I think that, well, I disagree with them is probably all I need to say about that. For this video, I think there's other problems too. I think that top end speed is an important thing to be able to achieve, and I think that monster strength is at least as much of a problem as broken builds are. So I'll leave it at that. They had nothing to say about the Druid class at this time. It's still going to be in the game, but they have nothing really to announce about it. They said that they have no intention of doing mid-season or, in between big patches, no big balance changes unless it's like game-breakingly bad. So this is a reversal where at the start they had hoped to be able to do things on the fly, once a week or less to be able to adjust things. They're not going to be doing that. They're going to wait for the big patches. They were asked about this post-death looting, which I guess last epoch introduced at least everything that was on your screen could come with you if you died. Grinding Gear Games has no plans for that for Path of Exile 2. If you're dead, you're dead. To me, that's all the more reason to make sure that maps have at least 2 portals, no matter how hard they are. In fact, the more hard they are, the more I might just want one little moment of forgiveness. You don't need to give me all 6, but give me one moment of forgiveness. Existing Ascendancies will see balance changes both up and down by the sounds of it. There will be cases of Ascendancies getting stronger, some getting weaker. There will be no changes to the Temporalis item other than availability. So obviously, character balance nerfs means that it will be harder to do the content that grants the Temporalis, fewer on the market that way. And maybe more importantly, they've patched up the duplication bug that was allowing people to flood the market with Temporalis. So the idea is that, yes, Temporalis will still be crazy overpowered, but there won't be as many of them. It will be more of a chase item. It will not be a mandatory build around because you can't. You won't be able to afford it. So, for better or for worse. More additional notes from the article. They think that the full release of the game could still happen in 2025, which was a surprise to me. My initial thought, based on the size of this content release here and the amount of time they took to work on it, I said, wow, they must still have a lot of work ahead of them. I don't think they're going to make 2025. But what I didn't know, the other thing they announced, was they actually said that they could launch what they're calling full release. Debatable whether it truly is, but without all classes. To me, I don't know if that is a full release, if all the classes that they announced as being part of the core game are not there, not as part of an expansion or something. In fact, they suspect that they are planning on launching without all the classes in place. So that to me says that they just want to be able to say that they've launched the game in full and then introduce the other classes at future content updates. That's a little disappointing, but we'll just have to see what they do. If they stick to this and launch without all full classes, yeah, I would say Christmas time 2025 is probably a very fair guess for when we would see it. They love to launch big stuff around the time that they know people are going to have a little break, a little time to play. They said that yes, more Path of Exile 1 owned and purchased cosmetics will be unlocked for use in Path of Exile 2 as well. PoE 1 will continue to receive updates, but a slightly disappointing update for those of us who play it is that the PoE 2 releases may sometimes take priority. There may be more than one of those in a row before we get a Path of Exile 1 content update. So if you're a Path of Exile 2 only player, good news for you, I suppose. They tease some kind of map navigation improvements, something about getting around the map, how that's clunky right now, that they hope will be coming in patch 0.21. They didn't say what that would be, but something to look forward to. And just last little point, there would be the Atlas tree would be expanded both in terms of the number of nodes available and the number of points that you have to assign to those nodes. So with that, that is all for the update and the article. I kind of only went over the high-level points, not a deep dive, but just wanted to bring you something for those of you who didn't watch the initial reveal. I will link to that down in the description below, as well as to the article. With that, brings me to the end of the video. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take it easy.